Back to Basics. I'm Steve Smith, the webinar coordinator, also a business mentor here at SCORE in Fairfield County. I'll be your host today. Our presenter is Raquel Virgo, and more about Raquel in just a moment. For those of you that have been on the webinars before, you know that now I'm going to give you a little bit of information on SCORE itself before we get to the webinar content. So some of you may have heard this before, but it's still good information to know. SCORE is a part of the Small Business Administration of the U.S. government, founded in the mid-'60s. Around the United States, there are more than 10,000 volunteers and more than 300 SCORE local offices. Here in Fairfield County, which encompasses everything from Greenwich up through and including Bridgeport, but not Ridgefield or Danbury, we have about 130 volunteers currently, with varying degrees of industry expertise, business process expertise, and subject matter expertise. We offer really three main sets of value into the small business marketplace. One is a series of workshops and webinars. Webinar, obviously, you're on right now. We do about 130 workshops and about 24 webinars per year. We also do one-on-one counseling and mentoring in our offices on East Avenue in Norwalk, sometimes in other venues as well that make sense to the counselors and the counselees. Also, and I can't really overemphasize this, is that our website, which is fairfieldcounty.score.org, is a vast resource of information. There's all kinds of sources of descriptions of tools and techniques to use in the small business environment, frequently asked questions of small businesses, and, importantly, a list of our workshops and webinars. The webinars, by the way, are recorded. I'll probably say this 2 or 3 more times because we get this question a lot, but they are recorded and they will be available through our website later this afternoon, maybe not until tomorrow morning, but clearly within the next 24 hours. Our next webinar is July 3rd, yes, the day before the 4th of July, and the subject will be digital marketing, optimizing digital images. It's all about digital, so please sign up for that workshop. Again, it'll be on July 3rd. For that webinar, you'll get the usual reminders via email, and I think you probably already have gotten one, actually. Another thing to keep in mind, a lot of you out there are thinking about starting a new business, and I just wanted to remind everybody that our very popular workshop series, Simple Steps for Starting Your Business, will have its fall session start on September 6th at the Maroon Hotel in Danbury, M-A-R-O-N Hotel in Danbury. Now, today's event, we're going to stop sharply at 1 o'clock. We always do. We're trying to respect your time, and we know that there's never enough of it. Again, the slides will be available at fairfieldcounty.score.org by the end of the day. And we have set up time for Q&A at the end of Raquel's presentation. So if you look on your screen, you'll see a chat room down in the lower left-hand column. That's where I'd like you to put your questions. And for the most part, I'll wait till the end of Raquel's presentation before we kind of pick the best ones or the ones that are kind of center around the theme of her presentation, and we'll answer those at that time. At the conclusion of the webinar, you're going to be receiving an email asking you to evaluate the quality of the webinar. Please fill that out. I'm surprised at how many people do versus, I don't do it enough when I'm asked, but I really appreciate that. Now, on to our speaker, and let's get to the meat of things here. Raquel Virgo has over a decade of experience in fundraising for nonprofits, both in New York City and in Connecticut. She's raised more than $20 million for causes related primarily to youth, education, workforce development, homelessness, criminal justice reform, and environmental education. That's a very impressive list. She currently serves as the founder and managing consultant of a fundraising consulting firm, Women of Change. in which she works for several nonprofits in the Connecticut, New York, and actually Texas and Virginia as well. So she's reaching out. I'm going to introduce now Raquel and turn it over to her, and she'll be with you for the next 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll come back for Q&A. And again, put your questions down in that chat room. Thank you very much. Raquel?
Thank you for that introduction, and welcome to Grant Writing 101, Back to Basics. Today we will be discussing a few key topics when it comes to submitting grant applications. One, preparation for writing and submitting applications, what to expect with regard to the format and requirements, as well as where to find grant opportunities, which I'm sure many of you would like to know. So starting off with preparation for writing and submitting grant applications, this is the part that you are urged to do your homework, beginning with prospect research. Prospect research is the process by which you seek out and identify grant opportunities. During this process, you are researching the mission, goals, and values of the grant maker. The grant maker can be anyone from a foundation to a corporation or small family foundation, or even your local Walmart can be a grant maker. The second step after you have done your research about the potential grant maker, you should familiarize yourself with the deadline, the application requirements, format of the grant applications, restrictions, and other details of that particular grant opportunity. Next, you'd want to become familiar with the actual grants awarded to other organizations. So you'd want to find out how much money that particular organization gives out to nonprofits. You want to find out who they give to and for what reason. So once you've identified your potential sources of support, again, that could be a foundation or corporation or other sources. Once you've identified that source and you know what their deadline is, you know what the application requirements are, you'd want to move on to becoming even more familiar with that application process. So again, noting the deadline and making sure that you're on time. So that means not only holding yourself accountable to submit an application in a timely fashion, but also anticipating what you need from others if required. So with being on time, I can't stress enough that you want to anticipate submission difficulties, and this is for submitting online or hard copy grant applications. To clarify, this means that many foundations and even corporations have an online application that you are inputting the details of your grant application directly into an online form or through a portal, which many foundations have, or by hard copy. Many other foundations do require still that you mail in a hard copy of that application. So you actually have to physically print it out and mail it to them. And in some cases, you may be able to even drop it off. But you want to anticipate any difficulties and not wait till the last minute. And finally, as I had mentioned before, you should anticipate what you need from others and get it early, right? So most nonprofit organizations have a specific department. That means development or fundraising or whatever it's called, resource development, whatever it's called at your organization or any others that you work with. That department is usually responsible, or person is usually responsible for the writing and submission of grant applications. However, you often do have to rely on others to pull together other pieces of a grant application. For example, a budget, which we'll discuss later on in this webinar. You may have to pull in folks from your finance department, for example, to prepare a budget. So if there are different pieces of a grant application that you need to get from other people, get it early, ask for it early so that you have it early enough and you can make changes, revisions, whatever you need to do in order to get your application submitted on time. Be complete. So when completing a grant application, you want to be sure that you have answered every single question that is required, whatever is relevant to you, because if you do not, your grant application can be easily declined just by virtue of you missed something. So I'd urge you to check, double check, and even triple check the instructions for what is required in that grant application. Again, answer all questions completely, making sure that you have not missed anything. Sometimes foundations and corporations and others who roll out grant applications have questions that may have multiple things buried in it, right? So they may ask about the target population that you're serving, for example, but then they may ask another question within that particular question about the target population. Make sure that you answer everything that they're asking for. Include all requested supporting materials with required signature seals, etc. So you will find when completing a grant application, not only do the applications require the actual written portion, your narrative, but they often also require other supporting materials that tells a story about your organization. And we'll talk more about those supporting materials later on in this webinar as well. Lastly, if it's an online application, I'd urge you to check all links and drop-down menus in that online application. Because what often happens, you may answer a question and then another question comes out as you answer that. So you want to go into an online application early and just move through the application and see what is required and making sure that you answer every single question that is there. Because once again, as I had mentioned before, if you do not answer every question, a potential funder can easily decline your application based on that. So be complete. In the application itself, and when you are preparing to submit, you want to be sure that, one, you're identifying alignment between the foundation's goals and your mission. So once you have identified this potential funder, right, after your prospect research that we talked about, you want to be sure that what they are hoping to fund is directly aligned with the work that you actually do. Then you want to, when preparing your application, you want to write as if the reader knows nothing about your organization. My rule of thumb is to write about the organization as if I'm explaining what they do to my mom or somebody who has no idea, has never heard of you, because you have to make the assumption they don't know you. Next, you want to make sure to mirror the foundation or the corporation's language, right? So many times potential funders will use specific language referencing what they are looking for out of an organization. So, for example, they may refer to low-income populations as low to moderate income, or LMIs, right? So you want to mirror that exact language in your application, making sure that they know what you're talking about and that, again, it's in alignment with what they are hoping to fund. Next, you want to make sure if you're talking about your target population or you're justifying a need for funding and you want to use data, you want to make sure to use data from reputed sources and make sure you cite those sources. Wikipedia is not a reputable source, but you want to be sure that when you are looking up anything that is relevant to your organization, when you're stating what the need is for who you're serving or what you're doing, you want to make sure that you are citing accurate data and use data that's as recent as possible. In some cases, you may not be able to find something that, some data that may have came out in 2017 or 18. You may find something that, the last time the data was available was 2015, for example. That's what you want to use. Moving into the grant application itself, I just want to highlight some specific areas that the applications usually require. First, and always that's always required, is the mission and history. So in order for a potential funder to get to know you, you have to tell them what your mission is, how you came about, because that is how they become familiar with you. In addition, you'd also want to tell them about your programs and accomplishments. So if you are a large organization or even a smaller organization that has several different programs, you need to tell them about each of those programs. You want to be as succinct as possible because you want room to be able to describe the rest of your application and talk about the need and focus on what you need to focus on in the application. But you want to be able to tell a story about your programs and accomplishments, what you've achieved since you've been in existence, what you've achieved over the past year or two. However, the foundation or corporation wants to see it. In some cases, they may tell you, we want to know what are your accomplishments over the past 3 years. So that's what you need to provide to them. But these are some standard elements that you'll see in almost every single grant application. Need, as I had referred to earlier, this is where you begin to make the case for funding your program or organization. So, for example, if you work for an organization that targets and works with homeless families in Fairfield County, you want to convey the need for your program, for your services. Where are deficiencies in services to this specific population? And just basically tee up what you are able to do in support of that population or to fill the gaps in services. So you want to beef up the need, and this is usually the section that you talk about, that you include those data sources about the target population. And then rolling into the target population, obviously this is where you describe who you're serving. So as I mentioned before, as an example, if you're serving homeless families, this is the section that you would talk about those homeless families, where they came from, who they are, what their demographics are. So this is the section that you talk about them. Program overview and request. So program here can be swapped out for organization overview and request depending on the type of application that you're submitting, or the type of request, I should say, that you're submitting. So you may be, if you're submitting a program request, so meaning that you're looking to fund a specific program within your organization, this is where you would talk about that program. If you are looking to fund general operations of your organization, meaning you're looking for funding to spread across your organization in key areas of need, this is where you talk about, again, your overall need in your overall organization. And this is also where you ask for money. So this is where you're making the case for, okay, this is what I need to serve this population of homeless families in Fairfield County. This is how much I need, and this is what the funding will do. And that leads us into the next section of goals and outcomes. Goals and outcomes are what you are hoping to achieve with your funding. So if you are asking a foundation for $25,000, for example, you need to be able to explain why you need it, what you will use it for, and what you are hoping to achieve with those dollars. And we'll talk a little bit more about goals and outcomes specifically because many foundations have very detailed or very involved questions about goals and outcomes. So we'll get to that in a minute, as well as measurement and evaluation, which is how you will measure your success. Timeline. This is where you talk about how long will it take you to achieve those goals and outcomes that you outlined in the previous section, right? So if a foundation is hoping to allocate 1-year grants to an organization, so that's where you're talking about, that's where you want to say the timeline is for 1 year. Or if they have a multi-year opportunity, this is also where you can say that. So you can align your need, you can align your the funding request with that timeline. So if they're giving out 3-year grants, your timeline is 3 years. Staffing. This is where you're talking about who is actually doing the work within your organization. So if you actually have paid staff doing the work, or even if you have volunteers who are doing the work on behalf of your organization, this is where you're talking about them and what their relevant skills. Experience. Again, this kind of ties into the staffing. This is where you're talking about the experience of your staff or volunteers, as well as the experience of the organization in working in that particular field. Budget. Obviously, this is pretty self-explanatory. Again, this is where you talk about, okay, I'm requesting $25,000 for my organization. This is how I'm going to spend it. As well as this may be where, if it's a general operating request, this may be where you're talking about the overall budget for the organization. But it depends on the application in this case. Supporting materials, I will get into that a little bit later as well, but it's usually inclusive of some of the same materials from one application to the next. So this is your organization budget, financial statements, and other documents.
Raquel, so if I have one question here, which I think might be kind of a basic one that it'd be good to answer now. It comes from Tiffany, and she says, what is the difference between a block grant and a foundation grant? Can you define a foundation grant?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Tiffany. A block grant is typically from funds that come down from the federal government to localities. So as an example, a block grant here in the state of Connecticut would be funds that come from the federal government down into, let's say, the city of Stamford to allocate out to nonprofit organizations who bid for that funding. Usually those funds are for a specific cause or reason, so you can use that for the most part, they focus on community development. So community development could mean that they're looking to support the general operations of your organization, or they're looking to fund something that, like some capital project at your organization. For example, I know in the past for a block grant, an organization I worked with applied to the city of Stamford to purchase a backup generator because they needed that to house families 24/7 since they were a homeless services provider. A foundation grant is literally a grant opportunity that's provided by a foundation, a private foundation. Whether that can be a large foundation or a small family foundation, it doesn't really matter, but that it's private funding provided to or available to nonprofit organizations who submit an application.
Great. Thanks for that very good answer. And go ahead.
So regarding goals and outcomes within your grant application, again, so you're asking for a specific dollar amount. You're telling the story of what you're going to do with that dollar amount. But then now in the goals and outcomes sections, you're talking about what are you hoping to achieve as a result of those dollars coming to you. So for your goals, you want to make sure that they are realistic and measurable, right? So if you are asking for $5,000, you should make sure that realistic meaning that you can actually achieve that goal, but also it's financially possible for you to achieve that particular goal with that $5,000 request. You also want to make sure that your goals align with your mission, vision, and values for your organization. And lastly, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that your goals also align with your budget. So your budget meaning the budget that you're proposing, like the request amount, as well as the budget for the organization itself. Outcomes tell how many will be served, helped, etc. So this is really where you're talking about the quantity of services, right? And outcomes also demonstrate the difference a program, service, or organization will make in the lives of the people that you are hoping to serve, right? So organizations want to know, foundations, want to know what is the benefit to your target population. How are you going to address the need that you previously identified in this grant application? And so this is where you're talking about, as a result of X, I'm going to achieve Y. So this is just a chart that just shows what foundations typically like to see with regard to laying out, evaluating your goals and outcomes. So again, they want to know that quantity, how much did you serve? How much did you deliver? How well did you do it? What was the change that you produced? And what is the quality of change that you produced? So in evaluating your goals and outcomes, this can be done by, as an example, distributing surveys to your target population. This can be done by assessing the difference. So before receiving your services, what was the situation for your target population, and what has changed after, and how did you gather that information, right? So did you administer surveys to the population that you're serving? Did you take attendance at your workshops or your classes if it's a different type of organization? So it depends on the type of services that you're providing, as well as who you're serving and what you're doing in terms of how you will measure your goals and outcomes and evaluate your impact. Budget and supporting materials. So there are a few supporting materials that are pretty standard across grant applications. So the budget and budget narrative, that's usually sometimes it's one document, sometimes it's two different things. So your line item budget explains the income and expenses for that particular request, right? So if Foundation X is you're hoping to get $25,000 from that foundation, you need to tell them, is there other income that's coming in as to support that particular program or service? And that's where you lay that out in the income portion. What are the expenses that are related to this specific budget or this request? Supporting materials, other supporting materials are your IRS determination letter. That proves that you have your 501c3 status or 501c4, depending on the type of organization you are. Audited financial statements. 990s, the Form 990s. So this is something that basically lays out what the funding that your organization has. It gives detailed information about the funds that have come into your organization, some of your expenses, like mainly with regard to who is on staff. So it depends on your organization as to whether or not you need to submit. So newer organizations don't typically have Form 990s available or audited financial statements. Your board of directors list. This just lists out the names and contact information, maybe, as well as their positions on the board. A staffing chart to lay out who works for your organization, because foundations or whatever funder you're applying to wants to know that you have capacity to do the services that you're promising to do in your application. List of funding sources. Who else is supporting you? So they want to know, where else does your money come from? And then finally, your organization's budget. So this shows the bigger picture of all of the money that comes into your organization, all of your income and expenses. What are you paying for staffing? So this allows a foundation or any potential funder to see where your money comes from, who you're paying out. So this is an extremely important document and is usually required for every single grant application. Now that you've gone through the whole application and you're ready to submit, just a few things that I'd like to highlight. Be very familiar with submission requirements and format. You know, that's something that you do early on, but I would suggest that you take a second and third look at what those requirements are. Again, give yourself plenty of time for submission. My rule, I like to submit grant applications at least 3 days before the actual deadline, and if I can do so even before that, I try to. But you almost never want to submit the same day that it's due because anything can go wrong. Have someone else review or edit before you submit. This is just double-checking yourself to make sure that you've answered every single question required and that you fulfilled every requirement, so you've included all of your attachments and other supporting material. And then lastly, you want to make sure to save a full copy of the application for yourself. So whether that's a hard copy submission that you had to mail in or an online application, you should always save a copy for yourself. For online applications, I would suggest that when completing those, you prepare a Word document before making the submission online. If you can extract the questions and put them into a Word document ahead of time, you can edit your responses directly on that Word document and then literally just copy and paste your responses into that online application later. But always save a copy for yourself so you have record of it. Now the good part, where to find grant opportunities. There are many different resources for finding grant opportunities. So there is the Foundation Directory online. This is a part of Foundation Search. This is a part of the Foundation Center. The Foundation Center is an online resource where you can plug in the name of a particular foundation and find a little bit more detail about them, including their giving. But if you don't have access to the online research for the Foundation Center, I believe the Greenwich Library and several other libraries have a subscription for Foundation Center and Foundation Directory online, which is within that, that you can utilize for free while in the library. Foundation Search and Foundation Directory online are a paid subscription. Foundation Search is another resource, as well as Grants Watch. Those are also paid subscriptions. Philanthropy Digest, Inside Philanthropy, and grants.gov are all free resources to find grant opportunities. Philanthropy Digest and Inside Philanthropy happen to provide more information about private funding opportunities, whereas grants.gov provides information about contracting opportunities with the federal government and also sometimes the state that you are in. And now we come to the questions and answer segment. I see we have a few questions.
Yeah, Raquel, I'll take it here. I've been kind of watching these. We've got some that are look like could be their own doctoral thesis, but let me see if I can. Let's start with an easy one. Back some time ago, a person asked, "What are some useful sources to get information about grant writing?" I think you've kind of answered that subsequently, but if you just want to touch on it again. So you're thinking of writing. You want to write a grant. Where can you go to get the information? I think you just said it on your last slide. But what do you think would be, typically, what would you do? If you were to do it right now?
So some of those same resources that I highlight about where to find grant opportunities also provide resources for writing the actual applications. But there is also some fundraising associations that you can find some free resources. So, for example, I'm a member of the Association for Fundraising Professionals. They have many resources available that you can find out about how to write a grant application or how to write a sponsorship letter, for example. But all of them may have, except maybe grants.gov, would have some resources where you can look into to help guide you during the process of writing a grant application.
All right, good. Excellent. And also, Janet Adams has tossed in the mix here that the Westport Library also has access to a foundation directory. And then Bud Freund asked, do libraries have the subscriptions to the grant search sites?
So that is correct. I believe Westport Library does have access to the Foundation Directory. But then if libraries have subscriptions, no, they don't all have subscriptions. Just as far as I know, the two that we've mentioned, Greenwich Library has the Foundation Directory online or Foundation Center subscription, but they don't typically have those subscriptions.
Okay, I'm going to give you a hard one now. It came in a little while ago. So it comes from Philip Brady, and he says, my organization is brand new, and I serve as the sole owner and operator. I've applied for a few grants, but tend to struggle when it comes to the budget section of the grants. I know you mentioned that there may be other individuals in your finance department, et cetera, that can do this, but in my situation, it's just me operating solo. What recommendations do you have in this kind of a scenario? Would you like to think about that for a minute? Or
I think I would have to ask that we have a conversation after. So if you contact me, I think there's a more complicated answer to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I figured that's a very specific, very individual kind of a situation. I also have another question here that says, are all grants aimed at targeting a specific population? What if the assisted population was general society or an overseas population or something of that general nature?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the end of that question.
Well, okay, so I think what the person is saying, what you've been talking about is that these grants are aimed at a very specific population, like homeless people in Bridgeport or something like that. What if you wanted to get a grant for a larger, more broad, less specifically designed population? And in the examples, you said like general society or an overseas population, say, poor people or villagers in Namibia or something like that. Does that make any sense?
So, again, that would depend on your organization, right? So, if you are an organization that targets specific populations locally or abroad, it doesn't really make a difference. But whoever is the beneficiary of your services, that is your target population. So if your organization does work in support of families in Fairfield County, that's your target population. If your work is to support villagers in Guatemala, in a specific village, that is your target population. Organizations don't typically have as their target general society, but they usually have a focus on who they would like to serve as beneficiaries of their services.
Okay, good. Thank you. Another question here. Now, this person is saying that can you speak further on the types of grants and the types of organizations which apply for grant funding? They make the comment that the presentation seems tilted towards nonprofits targeting grants for specific financially insecure groups. So back to the core question was, can you speak further on the types of grants and the types of organizations which apply for grant funding?
So there are different types of grants to different types of organizations, but for this particular webinar, we're focused on grants to nonprofit organizations. So there are grants available to small for-profit businesses, for example, but this one is targeted specifically to nonprofit organizations. And they don't necessarily have to serve financially insecure groups, but I was just using those as an example. It depends on what your organization does.
Okay. Good, thanks. So here's a question from Dennis saying, do you have a good sample that you would or could share of a grant, of a written grant that was successful?
I have some examples of, I can't really share with you grant applications that I've written because that's privileged information. But what I can do is if you email me, I can send you some samples that I have, as well as some additional tips to help guide you through the grant writing process.
Okay, great. That and by the way, you can see Raquel's contact information on these slides in case you missed that. So let's see here. I'll go back to Leonard's question. He's a tutor, and he'd like to know: do they have grants that can help you start a nonprofit business? Are there grants that can help you start a nonprofit business? And if there is, do they help with your expenses since it's a nonprofit?
Yes, there are grants for nonprofit organizations just getting started. Typically what you're looking for are seed grants, SEED, and those are, to help you with things from acquiring your 501c3 to hiring your first set of staff members. Typically when organizations are just getting started and they don't have their nonprofit exempt status, a lot of organizations may opt to use a fiscal sponsor. So that can be another nonprofit organization, like your church, for example, and use that as the fiscal sponsor. So what that means is if you are awarded a grant and you have a fiscal sponsor, that fiscal sponsor is the actual recipient of that grant. It comes to them, and then they have to write a check to you in order for you to do whatever work it is that you proposed. And then there was another part of this question, right?
Do they help with your expenses as a nonprofit?
So, yes, that's essentially what your grant is for, to help pay for expenses that your organization is incurring to do the work that you propose to do in your grant application. So to answer that, yes.
Great. So this is the answer to this question has to be yes, but I'm just going to feed it to you anyway. Are there any technology or startup-focused grants?
Yes, there are technology and startup-focused grants. Again, I would urge you to look into some of the resources that I previously listed to find targeted grants for technology or for startup. Usually when you go into one of those resources for like Philanthropy Digest, for example, they literally have headings for different areas where you can find grant opportunities. So there may be one for aging, or there may be one for agriculture, or for technology or health. But you'd want to look for opportunities that are aligned with the focus of your organization.
Okay, good. And I've got several people here wanting to contact you, as you can imagine. And they're asking if it's okay for them to contact you on this email address, and I would just say yes. That of course that's what it's actually there for. So it's Raquel at WOCgranted.com. Okay, so let me hope that answered the questions of the people that asked that. Let's just see here. And there's another question. Again, this presentation in its current PowerPoint format will be at our website, fairfieldcounty.score.org. That's also on the slides, about within 24 hours of the end of this presentation. Okay, so here's a question from Bonnie. It says, I am eligible for grants through my New York State Grants Gateway, but when it comes to winning a grant and then implementing a budget, hiring people to implement the purpose of the grant giving. Let's see, it comes to winning a grant and then implementing a budget, like hiring people to implement the purpose of the grant. I guess what she's saying here is that I'm eligible for grants through New York State, but when it comes to winning a grant, and that I have problems implementing it. I think that's the question. Maybe Bonnie, I'm sure I didn't say that properly. You might want to just give me another couple words on that, and I'll skip on to the next one then for now. So Philip Brady's saying, I have a nonprofit organization. What is typically the standard for salary, et cetera, to yourself and employees, or even fees for operations? I would imagine it's a thin line. So it's a nonprofit organization kind of interested in how do you figure out how to pay yourself and the employees. Can you answer that one?
Yeah, so it depends on what a foundation or whatever funding source you're applying to is what they say that they will cover. Some funders may say specifically that they don't want to pay for salaries. They may say that they specifically want to support program expenses, right? So that means paying for transportation or paying for relevant technology or paying for supplies and materials, right? So they may not want to pay for salaries. And with regard to determining what you'd pay for salary, I guess that would be dependent upon the need within your organization and as well as if you can justify that salary in your budget.
Yeah, that's all very logical, for sure. Okay, so I don't have any other questions that we haven't looked at. Bonnie didn't come back to me, and I can't really figure that one out. So there is one here that said, how do I, let's see, where was this? I want to make sure I answer as many of these as we can. Here's one from saying, where does one get training for your profession?
That's a funny question. I'm sorry. I laugh at that question only because I train by doing. But now there are crash courses in grant writing and fundraising offered at different colleges and universities. I think maybe Norwalk Community College has a grant writing course that's much more intensive, and even what UConn or Fairfield University, for example, they may have specific nonprofit management or nonprofit leadership programs that offer a grant writing course. But all of those, keep in mind, they are paid resources. So, but the Foundation Center does also provide training classes, both in webinar format and in person. In person, it's typically conducted in New York City, where they're based. But they often do provide grant writing or other fundraising workshops.
Okay, and here's a final question. I'm going to feed you here from Tiffany saying, I like this question a lot. Do I request money for myself?
If you're a grant writer, well, if you are a part of an organization that is requesting funding, you work there, right? So they would ask for in their request, there's usually a line for administrative costs that you can plug into your budget, and usually what you're paying a grant writer or your development staff is built into those administrative costs. Or if you're a consultant, then they would build that into a line of your request budget to pay for that consultant. But by yourself, not really.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap up here. I think, Bonnie, maybe you want to send questions directly to
Okay, so